I'm Paul Salvatori, and this is Palestine in Perspective for the Palestine Chronicle. In this episode, I'm speaking with Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University, historian of Palestine and the Middle East, and author of several books, his latest being The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, the book published 2020. He cordially accepted my invitation to talk with him about the myth that there is a war or conflict between Palestine and Israel, rather than an ongoing campaign by Israel against the Palestinian people of ethnic cleansing. As you'll hear, Professor Khalidi illuminates how this myth came about and is being sustained by mainstream discussions of Israel and Palestine, such as in corporate news media. Drawing from his impressive breadth of historical knowledge, Professor Khalidi also shares how Britain, the United States, and other Western powers have been seminal in developing and strengthening Israel in ways it would not have ever been able to do on its own. This includes supporting financially and otherwise the continuation of Israeli apartheid and criminality against the Palestinian people. The United States alone currently provides upwards of $3 billion per year to the Israeli military, which bombs and kills Palestinian families in Gaza, illegally detains Palestinian children, murders journalists, Shireen Abu Akla's death from May of this year being a high-profile example, raids the offices of Palestinian human rights organizations without permits, facilitates the demolition of entire Palestinian villages for Israeli construction projects, just to name a few. In some ways, it's hard to imagine that this is still going on in 2022, where we often hear we're in what's called a post-colonial world. Israel, and how it operates, of course, throws that directly into question. Here's the discussion. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi, for spending some time with me today. I know you have such a breadth of knowledge and writings, and I know that we talked about maybe focusing on this myth of the war or the conflict. Wondering if perhaps you can speak to what you believe are some of the main factors responsible for the myth that a war or a conflict, as we often hear, is taking place between Israel and Palestine.
This is based on a number of false assumptions. One is that the parties are in some measure of the same stature, or if anything, that the Palestinians or the Arabs are infinitely more powerful than the Zionist movement was or than Israel is. Another myth is that Israel is in this alone and that the Zionist project is a self-made miracle, entirely a result of dedication and flight from oppression and the grit and so forth of the early pioneers, and then later of Israel and the Israeli people. I mean, all myths have a grain of truth to them, and the Zionist movement certainly had all of those things, the pioneers and grit and so on and so forth. But the Zionist project was carried for its first several decades by British imperialism. It was and saw itself as a colonial project, which was dedicated to the takeover by mainly European Jews of a land inhabited by Palestinian Arabs. Zionist leaders made no bones about this. One of the major land purchase agencies was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. You don't call yourself a colonization agency unless you recognize that what you're engaged in is a European colonial project. Now, obviously, Zionism is different from every other colonial project. It is also a national project. It creates a national movement, which creates a nation state, the state of Israel, which is a state for its Jewish citizens. It's different in that it wasn't an extension of a metropolitan polity. It was unlike English people being sent to North America to extend the power of the sovereign, English sovereign, or French citizens being sent to North Africa to take over Algeria and make Algérie Française, to make Algeria French.
Right.
The settlers, the pioneers, the early Zionists saw themselves as people returning to their ancestral homeland to recreate a nation state, which was to be theirs. It wasn't to be British. They weren't English. They didn't see themselves as English. The English didn't see them as English. It was a national project at the same time as its method was settler colonial. And that's one of the anomalies about the Zionist project and about Israel. At the same time as it's a national project, it is engaged in the same kinds of processes that English settlers in Ireland or English settlers in Australia or English settlers in Kenya or English settlers in other parts of the world, or French or Portuguese or whatever, were engaged in. And that was recognized by the settlers themselves. This is not some evil anti-Semitic labeling by a bunch of Arab ideologues. This is how they saw themselves. You read Herzl's diaries. You read about Weizmann's, Herzl being the founder of the Zionist movement, the modern political project, Weizmann being his successor and the first president of the state of Israel. You read Zev Jabotinsky's writings, the founder of the ideological trend that's dominated Israeli politics since the 1970s, really for the last 45 years. And it's perfectly clear what they're engaged in. Jabotinsky says, we're going to turn Palestine into the land of Israel. We're going to transform this country. These people will resist. Every colonized people resists. We need an iron wall of what he means of British bayonets. Now, because the Zionist movement later differed with the British after 1939, there's another myth that Israel is a liberation movement from British imperialism. The Zionist movement was the spoiled stepchild of British imperialism from 1917 until 1939. Without the British crushing the Palestinians, as they did in the late 30s, all of what happened could not have happened as it happened. They were entirely dependent on the British. The British taught them everything they knew. I'm learning more about this since I wrote that book, actually. And so this myth, first of all, that Zionism is this heroic individual project is completely false. Britain was the spoiled stepchild of British imperialism. Without the British, they could not have done what they did. And then without American and Soviet support, they couldn't have succeeded in the next stage, which was the conquest of most of the country from 1947 until 1949. Britain disappears from the picture, but is replaced by much greater, more powerful actors, the United States and the Soviet Union. They ram through the partition resolution. They supply the arms. They supply the diplomatic support. They are the patrons of the new Israeli state and the midwives, if you want, of the new Israeli state. Without that support, again, what happened couldn't have happened as it happened. And this goes on into the modern period. Without American support, or at earlier phases, British and French support, Israel doesn't win these wars. Israel doesn't have this enormous superiority in weaponry, and so on and so forth. So it's not the Palestinians and all the Arabs against this tiny beleaguered little Jewish community. It's a project, a movement that is massively supported from the outside and has gone from success to success, in part, at least thanks to massive external support, huge amounts of capital, most of it generated by the Zionist movement itself. But later on, much of it a result of American taxpayer largesse. Israel is the largest single recipient of American aid since the 1970s, I believe. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is the whole Arab world is not arrayed against Israel. A number of Arab countries fought with Israel. And Arabs are sympathetic to the Palestinians, but the Arab world is a divided and contentious place. It's a place that until the 50s and 60s was largely controlled from the outside by the former colonial powers, if they didn't continue to control it. The British had troops in Cairo and the Canal Zone until 1954. They had troops in Jordan until well after that. They had troops in Iraq until 1958. One could go country by country. Most of North Africa was under French control through the 50s. So the Arab world, while it exists as a place where the language is spoken and people have sentiments in common, is under foreign control right up into the 50s, long after Israel is established. And parts of it are under European control until the 70s. The Emirates, Qatar, Oman, what later becomes the southern part of Yemen, these are under British control into the 70s. So the Arab world as a colossus which overshadows Israel is a myth. Yes, Arab sentiment is very supportive of the Palestinians. Arab sentiment is hostile to Zionism because it sees Zionism as planning to replace the Palestinians in their own country. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with the Jews per se. It has to do with an opposition to a movement that's taking an Arab country away from an Arab population. And so there's a felt feeling. But the governments, by and large, are not in tune with their peoples, nor in the 40s and 50s, nor in the 2000s. So you have governments that are unpopular, undemocratic, autocratic, repressive, which have good relations with Israel, which is most Arab governments today, but which don't represent the sentiments of their peoples as far as Palestine is concerned. We have polling on that in about a dozen Arab countries, and in every single one of them, public opinion doesn't support what their governments do. But those governments don't represent their people insofar as anything is concerned. It's not just Palestine. They're repressive, autocratic, non-democratic dictatorships, whether they're absolute monarchies, as in the Gulf, or whether they're military dictatorships, as in Egypt or Algeria or wherever.
Right. No, there's so much there to pick up on. I did notice also you made that point earlier, I believe, in another lecture where you said something about that most of the Arab population is in support of Palestine, but something we don't really hear too much about. It's interesting also that you mentioned that earlier on, there seems to have been more of an expression, like a obvious expression on the part of Zionists, that this is a settler colonial movement,
right.
and we're not apologizing. Is that different, do you feel, from the rhetoric we're hearing now, that there's almost like an attempt to obscure that or hide that?
Absolutely. Colonialism is a good thing in the eyes of the good and the great until World War II.
Okay.
Decolonization takes place. Up until that point, the colonial project worldwide, by which I'm talking about British colonialism, French colonialism, and so on, dominates most of the world. The only people in the entire interwar period between 1918 and 1939 that succeeds in freeing itself from European colonial control are the Irish. The single example of a people, the Indians do not succeed. The Indonesians do not succeed. The Nigerians, the Egyptians. I mean, even where nominal independence is granted by Britain, as in Egypt in 1922, they still control the country. They're in occupation of the country. They force a new government on the king in 1942. The British ambassador bangs down the gates with tanks and marches into the palace and tells the king, "You will appoint this prime minister." That's not independence. They do the same thing in Iraq in 1941. So nobody achieves independence in the interwar period. Colonialism is a good thing. Settler colonialism is in good odor. And so there's no reason for anyone, Zionist or otherwise, to be ashamed of being a settler in South Africa or a settler in Algeria or wherever it may be, a European settler in a non-European country. Things changed with World War II. They changed partly because colonialism, the colonial powers were all defeated in World War II. They were shown to be much less powerful than anybody thought, the French and so on and so forth. The Japanese roll them up, the Germans defeat them, they occupy France and so on. And secondly, the Zionist movement comes into conflict with the British in 1939. And so they seek another patron, and their patrons, it turns out, are the Americans and the Soviets. And from that moment on, the myth that Zionism was always anti-colonial is one that is burnished and fostered by Israeli propaganda. It's certainly true. They came into conflict with the British. They had deadly conflict in the mid 40s, killing British officials in Cairo, hanging British soldiers in Palestine, blowing up the British headquarters in Jerusalem, the King David Hotel. There's no question of conflict there. But this was not an anti-colonial war. This was biting the hand that had fed them because it was no longer feeding them sufficiently. It's similar to Ian Smith and Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence. We settlers know better than you, the metropole, or like the American War of Independence. The settlers decided they didn't need the metropole anymore. Well, that's what the Zionist movement decided. It was not an anti-colonial struggle. It was a struggle by a colonial project against its former patron, because they come into conflict with them and because they found better patrons.
I'm just wondering, when the British, with the Balfour Declaration, had promised Palestine, if I can put it that way,
they promised to establish a national Palestine.
Right. Was it always with the intention of creating a coexistence with the Palestinian people?
No. The idea was always to create a Jewish majority and then to give that that group self-determination within the terms of the League of Nations mandate and the Charter of the League of Nations, which would be an ally of Britain. The British had their own strategic objectives, which included control of Palestine. And during World War I, the cabinet decided that support of the Zionist movement was the best means of achieving this end that they had decided upon more than a decade before. Starting in 1906, 1907, 1908, British strategists realized they had to control Palestine to defend Egypt's eastern frontier, to have the shortest, the Mediterranean terminus of the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf. These are British strategic objectives that have nothing to do with the brown eyes of Jewish people or Zionism or anything. They have nothing to do with Palestine qua Palestine. They have to do with British strategic interests, the route to India, things like that, defending the Suez Canal. And so Zionism presents itself during World War I as an instrument to achieve this British strategic objective that had already been decided upon before 1917. And the British objective is not to create coexistence in Palestine. You have to read carefully the Balfour Declaration, and you have to read carefully the Mandate for Palestine, which is the ticket the British wrote for themselves in the League of Nations. The British dominated the League of Nations and with the French, and they're the ones who wrote the Mandate for Palestine. The Mandate for Palestine repeats verbatim the terms of the Balfour Declaration, and then it gives them full flesh. There's no mention of Palestinians or Arabs in the Balfour Declaration or the Mandate for Palestine. There's no mention of self-governing institutions for the Palestinians. There's mention of self-governing institutions for the Jewish community, which is less than 10% of the population at the time. There's mention of diplomatic representation for this community. There's mention of the British mandate having the obligation to do this, that, and the other to further the Zionist project. So the mandate is a prescription for the establishment of not a Jewish national home, but really a Jewish state, ultimately. There's a wonderful entry in Weizmann's diaries about a dinner party that he goes to with Lloyd George, who had been the prime minister of the cabinet that issued the Balfour Declaration, Balfour, who was the foreign secretary at the time, and Churchill, who was a cabinet minister at the time. And these are the three most ardent Zionists in the British cabinet at the time. And they say to him, of course, what we meant was a Jewish state. Once you get a majority, that's what you're going to have. So just keep bringing in the immigrants and taking over land, and we're going to help you. And, all will be for the best and the best of all possible. That's what the people who wrote the Balfour Declaration and the mandate intended. It was not that there should be equality between Arabs and Jews. There's no mention of Arabs or Palestinians in either of these documents. They're the overwhelming majority of the population. They are not entitled to self-determination, self-governing institutions, any of that stuff. There's only one people mentioned, the Jewish people. There's only one group with national rights, the Jews, in the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. The others are to have civil and religious rights, i.e. you are subordinate to this national group, which has political rights, and all you have are civil rights and religious rights. That's what the British intended. Now, things change over time. They're obliged to. They're dealing with a 90% Arab majority. It shrinks. By 1939, the Jewish minority is over 30%. So, and it's much more powerful. It controls more than half of the economy of Palestine by 1939. It has military forces that the British have been beefing up to help them fight the Arab revolt. It has an independent financial base. It has a demographic base. Ben-Gurion's diaries in the 30s show increasing optimism about their ability to take over the country, to win, and to create a Jewish state in an overwhelmingly Arab country. In 1947, the Arab population is 65% of the whole. Most of the population is still Arab, but they're confident that they can create a Jewish state, and they succeed.
Was the vision, the Nakba, was that something that both the British and the Zionists envisioned from the outset, or not?
I don't think the British thought that far. And remember, in 1939, they changed their policy. They decide that with World War II coming on, the Arabs are actually more important than the Jews. Why? They knew that World War II was about to begin. They knew that they're going to fight Germany and Italy. They knew that there are going to be various important battlefields in the Middle East. And of course, they're right about all of those things. Egypt, Libya, North Africa, Syria, Iraq are all battlefields in World War II. And Arab sentiment is virulently anti-British by 1939 because of their savage repression of the Arab revolt. there's a new revelation by the BBC of a lawsuit being brought on behalf of survivors of British repression for colonial atrocities carried out by the British during this oppression. The British knew that if they had to fight in North Africa and with Egypt and the Levant as their base, they needed to do something to shore up their support among the populations amongst whom they would be based. And so they shift from complete partisan support for the Zionist movement to a much more balanced position, which from the Zionist perspective is a betrayal. And from that moment on, everything changes in the relationship between the Zionist movement and the British.
Right.
So I think you have to look carefully at those kinds of historical junctures to understand how and why Zionism starts to pretend to be an anti-colonial movement, and the British position. So the British don't expect anything in 39. They eventually abandon the country because having mastered the Arab insurgency, they failed to master the Jewish insurgency that's subsequent to 39, that really breaks out in the 40s, the mid 40s.
I'm glad you brought up that article. It's perfect segue. I've seen it as well. And I was actually thinking about you because I know you actually touched on it earlier in our talk, but you've talked about it in others. This idea, I think you put it this way, of Israel's aggressive, correct me if I'm wrong, aggressive preemptiveness. That, or that's like one of the terms that you, that they use militarily and otherwise, that the Zionists actually adopt. And I'm wondering, like, how did that happen despite this conflict or falling out that they had?
Well, it happened before the falling out.
Okay.
The British basically taught them everything they knew in terms of counterinsurgent brutality. There's a specific officer, a man named Ord Wingate, who ends up as a major general in the British Army. He's a military intelligence officer. He creates units of selected fighters from the Zionist militias, the Haganah and the Palmach, and together with British soldiers. And he quotes special night squads. And he leads them in these vicious, savage attacks on Arab villages that are suspected of harboring terrorists. So the Palestinians are fighting to liberate themselves. They're, of course, in British parlance, terrorists. They're opposing the Zionist project. They're attacking Jewish settlements. They're attacking British troops. So from the British perspective, they're to be liquidated. And he does so in a particularly brutal way, taking the fight to the enemy, creating groups of people dressed like Arabs who infiltrate at night, shooting captured suspects, shooting people in the course of interrogation, blowing up houses over the homes of their people, destroying villages. These are tactics that the special night squads in particular teach to their Zionist mentees. The people who pass through this school of terrorism, or you can call it counterinsurgency if you want to use a neutral term, but it's a particular form of counterinsurgency, a particularly brutal form of counterinsurgency, are names that we know. Moshe Dayan was trained by Wingate. Yigal Allon was trained by Wingate. The first chief of staff of the Israeli army, Yitzhak Sadeh, was trained by Wingate, as were hundreds of others. So the lessons, the fruit of generations of British counterinsurgency, the Boer War, India, Ireland, Palestine in the 30s, is bequeathed to the people who are the nucleus of what becomes the Israeli army. So that method of taking the war to the enemy, of night raids, of atrocities, of blowing up houses over people's heads, of murdering, of assassination, of infiltrating the enemy and pretending to be the enemy and causing internecine conflict. These are things they learned from the British. These are things the British were doing in Ireland. These are things the British were doing in India. These are things the British perfected. Wingate was the apostle of this. It later on is picked up by other British officers. So a fellow named Frank Kitson, who becomes a full general in the British Army, takes it to Northern Ireland in the 1970s. He's the commander of the unit that carries out the Bloody Sunday in Derry in 1972. Commander of the unit that carries out the Ballymurphy massacre in Belfast, 1971. So the same tactics which the British are using all over the empire are distilled by Wingate, are bequeathed to the people who become the nucleus of the Israeli army, and then are used again in Britain's empire after World War II, and finally end up in Ireland during the Troubles.
Right. I mean, this kind of way of being militaristic, or however you would describe it, this aggressive preemptiveness, is that, would you say, the default mode of being of the Israeli state on a day-to-day basis now, today?
It's the default mode of any colonial settler project.
Okay.
It's the default mode of any colonial project. You have to awe the natives. You have to kill a few pour décourager les autres. I mean, there are 2 or 3 elements to it. One is legal regimes. One is terror, put bluntly. One is overawing displays of power. What we saw during the Queen's funeral were these incredibly disciplined, among other things, ranks of marching soldiers. Right. Well, the British used that sort of thing in India and in all the colonies to awe the natives. And when they had to, they used force. And they used all kinds of legal regimes, suspension of habeas corpus, administrative detention, torture, and so on and so forth. All colonial regimes must rely on those things. They have no legitimacy. They have to rely to a larger or lesser degree on force. And that's what Israel has done. Palestine was a majority Arab country. They had to ethnically cleanse it in order to create a state with a Jewish majority, which is what they do in 48, 49. Right. And to keep control over it, they have to use the methods. I mean, the British emergency regulations of 1945 have never been lifted in Israel. They were used against the Palestinian citizens of the state between 1948 and 1966. They had a military regime over the Arab areas of Israel. And the regulations the British used against the Arabs and the Zionists were being used by the Israeli state against the Palestinians. One of the people who protests the most vigorously is Menachem Begin in the Knesset. He says, these are Nazi laws. They were used against us. You cannot keep these laws. And of course they do. Nobody listens to Begin in those days. This is the 50s.
Yes.
So I don't think it's just Israel. It's all, I mean, what kind of regime did we create in the United States?
Yes.
We, the settlers, with the support of the British for the first century and a half. A regime that relied on essentially force. You have to, if you're facing an overwhelming indigenous majority.
Well, it's a great point, because maybe you could help me answer this question, because also here in Canada, there was settler colonialism. And in government policy, for example, we have things that are expressly committed to truth and reconciliation, efforts to address and rectify historical and ongoing wrongs committed against the indigenous population. Yet at the same time, Canada is one supporter of the Israeli regime.
Right.
So what is, I find this very counterintuitive, confusing. What is happening here?
Well, one thing that's happening is that the Israeli experiment has been whitewashed.
Okay.
On the one hand, in appealing to Americans, and I assume also Canadians and Australians, right, there's the settler pioneer myth. There's the white man standing against the dark native savage. And all of those things implicitly are part of we're just like you, and you should support us. I mean, it's now clothed in the only democracy in the Middle East is the slogan. Right. But beneath that, if you read a book like Exodus, or see a movie like Exodus, which is a movie that came out in the 60s, based on an awful novel by Leon Uris called Exodus. People of my generation and younger, people and a little older, people in their 70s and 60s, were deeply influenced by the movie. It depicts the Zionist movement in the years just before and after the independence of Israel as a sort of a Western frontier experiment.
Right.
And so on the one hand, on the other hand, there's a careful whitewashing of the idea that this is settler colonialism. We are the indigenous people of this land. There's a Jewish connection to the land of Israel, which of course is indisputable. There is a Jewish connection to the land of Israel. The religion starts in the land of Israel. I mean, there's a history there. There's a connection, obviously. And that ancient connection is mobilized in the service of a modern nationalism developed in Eastern Europe by people oppressed by somebody completely different than the Romans or the Arabs or the Muslims or anybody else, by Eastern European Orthodox autocracies of the Romanov and the Habsburg, or Western European countries that expelled the Jews and carried out pogroms and other atrocities against their Jewish populations. So a modern 19th and 20th century national movement mobilizes that memory. And there's nobody who doesn't know the Bible. There's nobody in Western societies, whether you're Christian or Jewish or atheist or agnostic or whatever you may be, or Muslim or Buddhist or Jain, you know about the Bible. And that has been mobilized. And so the last thing people think of when they think of Israel is this is just like what is done to the First Nations in Canada. This is just like what was done to Native Americans in the North. This is just like what was done to the indigenous population of Australia. And the difference, of course, is partly that in those other cases of white settler colonies of Britain, there was large-scale genocidal elimination of most of those populations. And the white population became the overwhelming majority in Canada and the United States and New Zealand and Australia, whatever the position of the indigenous populations is today, and whatever land recognitions we make and whatever attempts at that's the fact. That's not the case in Palestine. Arabs are at least equal to, or perhaps slightly more than Jews in the boundaries of what used to be mandatory Palestine, what is now Greater Israel, from the river to the sea. All of it is one sovereign entity, whether they rule the occupied territories in Gaza one way or another way. It's all part of the Israeli imperium. You don't enter, you don't exit, you don't have rights in that space unless you have the permission of Israel. So there are some Arabs who have Israeli citizenship. They have some rights, most don't, and they don't have any rights, basically. It's one space. And in that space, Arabs are now more numerous than Jews, but one group dominates absolutely. And people don't think of it in that way. They think of it in terms of the Holocaust, or they think of it in terms of the Bible, or they think of it in terms of the Israeli myth, which links, among other things, the Bible and the Holocaust and the persecution of Eastern European Jewry. And the fact that Israel won battle after battle in which it described itself as the underdog, and in some of which it was the underdog, but in most of which it was the massive overdog. I mean, 56, 67, even 73, where there were reverses of the Israeli army at the beginning, 82 when they invade Lebanon. They're overwhelmingly superior to their foes, but that's not the way it's pictured. It's the Arab Goliath against the Israeli David. Brilliant PR.
Well, that's what
among many other things, a successful PR project.
Well, certainly, and I feel quite often like people who are concerned about Palestine versus people who are supporting Israel are operating in like totally different discourses. I mean, just to pick up on a point you mentioned, because I feel it was echoed in a book I have here, the one, the conversation book between Chomsky and Pape. I think Chomsky makes a point to the effect that, to your point about, there's almost like an implicit understanding between these settler colonial nations that we did it and now we're going to help you. Is that kind of correct? Is that?
I think so. I use the same word, implicit. Yes. And I think Chomsky has it absolutely right.
Right.
That is sotto voce. Nobody ever says.
Yes, that's right.
But it is implicit. I think that's the important thing to understand.
Yes, certainly. I know, Dr. Khalidi, that you were involved in some of what was referred to, still is referred to as the peace talks of the 90s. I'm wondering if, when that first happened, whether there was a lot of optimism or promise around that, and how you saw that pan out, or
well,
yes,
I think there was a belief that in the wake of the first Intifada, which breaks out in 1987 and continues into the early 90s, that something had fundamentally changed. And certainly some Israeli leaders recognized that something had fundamentally changed. Rabin was one of them. Now, they didn't recognize that, they didn't believe that everything had changed. Rabin never gets to the point of accepting the idea of Palestinian self-determination, statehood, and independence and sovereignty. Never. His last speech excludes that before he's murdered by settlers, a settler, by someone who's in sympathy with the settler movement. And I think there was optimism on the side of Palestinians and many Israelis that a breakthrough was possible, and that some kind of resolution was possible. I wouldn't have been involved in those negotiations for the better part of 2 years if I didn't think there was some hope to do that. We very quickly learned this is the negotiations that start in Madrid in October, November of 1991. And that continued in Washington for a year and a half, and that ended in June of 1993, several months before the Oslo Accords were announced and signed on the White House lawn in September of that year. So in that period, what we learned was that there was a very low ceiling established by Israeli-American agreement many years before, essentially based on red lines drawn by Menachem Begin in the Camp David negotiations with Egypt and the United States back in 78, that there would never be Palestinian self-determination. There would never be Palestinian statehood. There would never be limits on settlement. There would never be Palestinian security control of anything. That Israel would continue to dominate and control the security of the entire space of Palestine, Israel, the land of Israel in the Israeli imaginary. And that settlement would continue and expand and never be limited. That was Begin's red line. And Sadat and Carter, to their eternal shame, accepted that. And that's the basis of everything that has followed. I mean, I sort of knew this, but a student of mine has written a wonderful book, Preventing Palestine, a former student teaching in the UK, which explains this in brilliant detail, using Israeli and American documents and other documents to show how from 78 through the 1980s, and really up until the 90s, when we went to Washington naively thinking we could change things. This was always I wouldn't say the bottom line. This was the glass ceiling, a very low ceiling it was. And that's the Oslo Accords. No self-determination, no statehood, no sovereignty, no security control, no limits on settlement, Israeli control of airspace, water, resources, land, most land. I mean, that's what was the limit. There were supposed to be negotiations to change some of those things, but they never led to a resolution. Everything that was offered by every Israeli prime minister in certain key spheres, whether it was Jerusalem or refugees, or whether it was full sovereignty, or whether it was security control, or whether control over the Jordan River Valley, control over water, reigning in settlements, was severely lacking in terms of the minimal things that Palestinians could have accepted. And that everybody understood was the outcome. The outcome was supposed to be two independent sovereign states. That was never envisaged by any Israeli leader. If sovereignty means control over your security and your borders and your groundwater and any settlements established on your territory, those were never on all those things.
No, I think it's a great point, because I feel like, again, to your other point on PR, it's often invoked, these talks sometimes to blame the victim.
Of course.
Like we tried, we did what we could, but this is now.
And you have enablers, the likes of Dennis Ross in his book, The Missing Piece, which is 820 odd pages, 840 pages long. An enabler of this status quo, of these negotiations, which were directed at keeping the things as they were, more or less, with some minor adjustments, obviously important adjustments, but minor in the long run, who contributed to that narrative. The people to blame were Arafat, the people to blame were the PLO, the people to blame were the Palestinians. They would never, they never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. This keeps being repeated. Abba Eban said it about the Arabs, and it's been reprised infinite number of times, blaming the victim essentially for not accepting their subjugation under the cover of this is an improvement. Well, it's basically, if you don't control security and you don't control your borders, you're subjugated.
Right. It's shocking how much of the public sometimes buys into that, because it's not true, right? That is the case, that those were for Palestinian sovereignty and rights and such. But even if that were the case, like, it's almost implicitly saying, because you have bad leadership, we're allowed to break the law, right? We can do what we want.
I mean, it's essentially a view that we are superior to you and we are entitled to these rights, and you are inferior to us and you are only entitled to a more limited.
Yes.
I mean, that's what you often have in these situations. Colonialism and of settler colonialism.
Sure.
There are implicit hierarchies, whether of race or religion or whatever they ethnicity. The laws of the state of Israel mandate that any Jewish person anywhere in the world is entitled to be a citizen of this state.
Right.
People who are indigenous to the land and whose families have lived there forever are not necessarily. It is a Jewish state with certain rights for Jews that do not exist for non-Jews.
Yes.
It's a structural inequality. It's a structural inferiority of one group as opposed to another group, and that's very rarely recognized.
Right. Yes. No, I think you mentioned it really well once, or you put it really well, put it very succinctly once, about how by definition, structurally, this cannot be a democracy yet. It's still referred to that way.
Exactly.
Yes. So I know, yeah, we're sort of wrapping up here, Dr. Khalid, but I'm just wondering before we end, if maybe you could share what it's been like, or the climate right now for American academics such as yourself doing critical work on Palestine.
Um, well, it depends on the academic and it depends on the media in which they're operating. Graduate students and people trying to seek jobs, it's a much more fraught situation. For junior faculty, it's a much more fraught. People without tenure, it's a much more fraught situation. It also depends on the university. Some places are more hospitable, some less. The general atmosphere, I would argue, has gotten better.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the student body, especially among young people, it's gotten much better. You see this in the polling. I mean, young people are more sympathetic, young Democrats anyway, are more sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are to Israelis. They're very sympathetic to Israelis, but they're even more sympathetic to Palestinians, according to this poll that came out on, I think, 538 or someplace, some site. And that's reflected in the student bodies of many universities. And so the atmosphere is different than when I was a student, when the student body was overwhelmingly unfavorable to anything Palestinian, or for that matter, Arab or Muslim, and where support for Israel was wall to wall among most students who cared anything about it. I mean, most probably didn't care, but for those who did. So I would say that, the cases in which people lose their jobs, whether in the media or universities, the cases where people are harassed,
right,
where people are suffering terrible, terrible treatment by the administrations of universities, are manifold. I mean, there are many, many, many such cases. There's an organization called Palestine Legal,
yes,
which works in the United States. There's a similar organization in Europe, which works to support academics and students face this kind of harassment, sometimes legal, sometimes administrative, sometimes by student groups, sometimes by outside groups attacking students. And there are hundreds of cases a year that they deal with.
Right.
Or they have dealt with hundreds of cases over the last few years. I don't remember how many per year.
Yes.
So it depends. For
Yes.
a faculty member who's tenured in a situation where the university has lots of students and other faculty who are generally supportive, situation can be quite tolerable. And a lot of money goes into this, of course. A lot of this has to do with money, has to do with donors, has to do with boards of trustees, has to do with the huge amounts of money pumped into Israel studies.
Right.
There's an amazing article just published, I think, either on Mondo Weiss or Jewish Currents.
Okay.
By Mary Cohen, I think is her name. I'm not sure of the name of the journalist. Brilliant article about the political pressures that are exerted in the field of Israel studies.
Oh, right.
To ensure that the people hired and the people who are featured are outspoken advocates for Israel and are in no way critical. They don't always succeed. At the same time, on the other hand, you have the beginning of Palestine studies. We have a Center for Palestine Studies.
Right.
Brown University has established the Mahmoud Darwish Chair in Palestine Studies. Other universities are setting up Palestine. I'm actually speaking at one in Canada, I believe it's Waterloo.
Oh, right, okay.
Where I think they're trying to set up a center.
Yes, oh, they are. That's right. I remember now. Yes.
There's some effort to do that at Berkeley. I don't know if it's going where it is. There are two centers in England, one at LSE, where Professor Pape is. I'm forgetting the name of it.
Exeter, I think.
Yes. So there are two of these centers in the UK. There are one or two in the United States, maybe others coming up. And there's at least one being. So things have obviously changed. On the other hand, the determination of well-heeled supporters, well-lawyered supporters of Israel has turned even more ferocious to shut down, essentially by accusing them of anti-Semitism, any partisans of any kind of fair play, as far as Palestine is concerned. Palestinian human rights, anything. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It's all smeared with this term anti-Semitism, any other means that can be used or used against.
It's a moral test. I mean, you often hear about Palestine being the litmus test, whether you support Palestine or not being the litmus test for your own progressive values. But I think also if we look at our society, we have to ask, are we really a moral one or not? in doing this. I'm always thinking about that, the way that we're just sort of giving in to these pressures for money, the reputation, instead of doing what's
the sad thing is that young people are changing quite rapidly and in the right direction. They're more critical, they're more open to, they know more, they have better access to information. They're not chained to the corporate mass media, just intimidated every time they say anything about Palestine. People are fired for opening their mouths. They have social media and all kinds of other. The problem is the money is in the hands of old people. So younger people in the Jewish community and elsewhere are more enlightened than their elders. They don't vote, unfortunately, as often as old people do, and they don't have as much money as old people.
Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I'll keep you posted. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. I learned a great deal just listening to Professor Khalidi. He certainly helped me arrive at a better historical understanding of Palestine and how not only the Israeli state came to be, but has for long been shielded by its international allies. The government of where I live, Canada, unfortunately is one, from being held accountable for the crimes it continues to perpetrate against the Palestinian people. One of the big takeaways for me of the discussion is that we, as I feel Professor Khalidi brought well into relief, still live in a world where nation-states, including of course Israel, are calling themselves democracies without taking seriously what that means. And if they are, at least theoretically, they're surely showing contempt for it. For to be a democracy is not, in contrast to Israel, to subjugate any one single population to a system of apartheid. Rather, it is to ensure that all people are treated equally under the law and enjoy the same rights and dignities. None are treated less than others, as Israel is treating, and violently so, Palestinians as non-persons or second-class citizens. Israel can call itself whatever it wants, but until the international community, such as by way of sanctions, holds it accountable for its crimes and mistreatment of the Palestinian people, it will never be a genuine democracy, for it is incapable of correcting itself. Israel, as it has proven for decades by its own behavior, both wants to keep destroying Palestinian life and build another society on the ruins of that. We can't allow it. However long it takes, Israel must be held accountable and the world be a place where no power prevents us, whatever our ethnicity, culture, or religion, from living together. That means appreciating and even celebrating the humanity in each one of us, overshadowed by hatred that has no place in this world. Till next time, I'm Paul Salvatori, and this is Palestine in Perspective.